This week on Security and Compliance Weekly, we're joined by Russell Mosley and Jim Nitterauer. They're both going to present some practical advice on how to leverage compliance requirements to implement security programs at small to mid-sized companies where budget, resources, and experience are often limited. In our second segment, we're going to follow up with Jim and Russell and have a discussion and Q&A about what they've presented to us. So join us as we tear down silos and build bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. Today's organizations face an evolving set of security threats and continually changing compliance requirements. As your business grows, privacy concerns only multiply and add to a dynamic set of priorities. Today's organizations need to integrate risk, security, and privacy into a cohesive program. Online Business Systems team of seasoned security practitioners work closely with you to assess your security posture, policies, procedures, and technologies, providing tailored solutions that are specifically aligned to your business's risk profile and ultimately ensure the protection of your brand. To learn more about Online Business Systems, go to securityweekly.com/online.
Welcome to episode number 8 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on November 26th, 2019. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, coming to you remotely from sunny Pasadena, Maryland. Also online are my co-hosts Scott Lyons, Josh Marpet, and Matt Alderman. Today, we're going to have a discussion based on a presentation given to us by Russell Mosley and Jim Nitterauer on building security and compliance programs on a budget. But first, we have a couple announcements. First announcements, if you want to go to our website, you can register for our last webcast of the year, which is with Core Security. You go to securityweekly.com, click on the webcast drop-down, and select registration. Also, if you've missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find them on our on-demand library. And remember, you can get 1 CPE credit for every webcast that you listen to. Secondly, we are currently running our annual listener feedback survey. So go to securityweekly.com, click on the survey tab, and select 2019 listener survey to submit your responses. And we really look forward to your feedback. Tell us how we're doing. Okay. Our topic for the week is building security and compliance programs at small businesses. We are joined by guest speakers Russell Mosley and Jim Nitterauer. And this actually came about because a couple weeks ago, Russell reached out to me, I think after an earlier episode, and said, hey, I do a talk and I give talks on building security at small organizations. Both Russell and Jim have worked together sort of presenting on this topic, most recently at a panel discussion this past summer at the Blue Team Village at DEF CON. In the interest of time, I will let them jump into the presentation and share with us what they want to about their bios and their background. Their bios are also on our wiki page if you're interested. So we're going to turn the microphone over to Russell and Jim during the first segment of our show today. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back for a Q&A period and discussion period with the co-hosts. So Russell, please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. So I'm Russell Mosley. Today, I'm the CISO of a rapidly growing medium-sized government contractor in the DC area. At my last role, I ran IT operations and information security for a smaller government contractor. I think about 50 employees or so at a company that runs their own data center and runs systems for the government. So we had to meet FISMA compliance at the FIPS 199 moderate level. So quite a bit of requirements for compliance, as well as annual SOC 2 audits. And so based on my experience meeting all of those controls, building out our security program and running it, I put together some talks on small and medium business security. So I'm going to pull up the presentation. While I do that, Jim, how about you say some things about yourself?
Well, Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Nitterauer. I'm a senior security engineer at AppRiver and Zix Corporation. I've been with AppRiver going on 14 years. My background is in systems engineering and building out hosted infrastructures in web hosting companies, but I've now migrated into doing more security related things. Right now we're trying to merge two companies together. One of them is very compliance oriented and publicly traded. That would be the company that bought us, Zix Corporation, and we're taking AppRiver to a level where their compliance is in congruence with what Zix has in place. So that's been a learning experience for me. I've recently moved over full-time to the security team, and I work with the CISO and CIO in implementing all of the different controls that we need to meet our compliance standards. The first one we've been working on has been SOX compliance, and now we're moving into the SOC 2 realm. So my experience isn't quite as vast as Russell, but mine's more on the engineering side of things. So ready when you are, Russell.
Okay, I have the deck up. Can we get it on the screen? All right, cool. I see it. So to kick this off, I've got a couple of screenshots here, and I'm going to read them for everyone who's listening on the podcast. First one was a Twitter conversation I was having with some folks, and someone who goes by Stack Smasher said back to me, SMBs meaning small and medium businesses, of course, don't want to spend money on coffee. And you want them to spend budget on InfoSec. They will do the minimum until they get pwned. You know, so we hear from the security community and of course from security product vendors that small organizations are doomed and they can't really afford to have a robust security posture. The second image on the screen here, this is actually from the DEF CON 25 call for papers. So I was poking around at their CFP that year, and I noticed that, you know, in addition to hacking talks and red team talks, they actually request people submit defensive talks. And the way they framed it that year was that defensive talks should be about the art of defense. And here's what they said. How do hackers defend their networks, servers, and applications in a world where only the largest enterprises can afford a robust defense? What can you do to have a chance at surviving modern class attacks? And that really got me thinking. It got me a little kind of irritated and thinking at the same time, which was probably their goal. You know, they wanted to hear from hackers, how can you hack defense when you have a really limited budget? And so that's when I started putting together a few presentations on doing security at small and medium businesses, because I completely disagree with the statement there that only the largest enterprises can afford to have a robust defense. You know, it's just not true that the size of an organization is the determining factor in the security program. There are many factors that come into play, and we're going to talk about that throughout this presentation. We're going to present an argument that small and mid-sized organizations can afford to have a robust security defensive posture, and demonstrate by talking about what can be done at small to medium-sized organizations with limited resources and budget in mind. And as Jeff said, it's going to be based off of my and Jim's experience building security programs at small to medium-sized businesses. And of course, compliance comes into play. As we mentioned, we've both been at organizations where we've had to meet PCI compliance, FISMA compliance, SOC. Jim said right now they're working on SOX. So we're going to walk through how you can meet compliance requirements for all of those. And we're going to use the NIST cybersecurity framework as our guide because, well, we have a whole slide on that, but I'm going to jump in. We're going to kind of use that as our guide to talk about how to put all the controls in place. And, you know, if you need to build a security program at a small or medium-sized business, how the NIST cybersecurity framework can be an excellent guide in doing that. Jim, feel free to jump in anytime here.
Yep, no worries, Russell. You're doing a fine job.
So quickly, what does it take to have a robust security posture at any size of business? We just threw together a few quick bullet points here. And number one, and I truly believe this is number one, no matter what the size of the company, you have to have management commitment. If the leadership of the organization isn't committed to information security and to investing in what it takes, investing in the resources, and as Jim said when we were chatting the other day, having the right mindset, you're never going to have a successful security program without management commitment. It has to be top down.
One of the things too that people don't understand is, I think, the definition of robust security, right? That's different for every business out there. What is security from our perspective may not be the minimum that your company needs based on your risk tolerance, right? And I think there's a misconception in the InfoSec community that security is an absolute thing. And I always ask people the question, how much security is enough? And the answer is just enough, because putting security in place is expensive and it's inhibiting to people's workflows. So you have to decide what level of security is just enough for your business, and that may not be the same as the next business that you work for. So that's always a good direction to take.
Absolutely. It's going to be tailored for the given organization. And speaking from our experience, working for federal government contractors, I'm fortunate to have the hammer of compliance if needed, to help convince the leaders of an organization to put some things in place, because every organization wants to do security correctly. They don't want to have a breach, right? And it's up to us security leaders to help them understand what needs to be done. But when you also have compliance requirements, like a federal government contractor or organization that takes credit cards and they want to adhere to PCI, that can really be a strong driver for putting all of the components of the security program in place.
Mm-hmm.
So the second bullet here is that you need to have a minimum set of policy, standard, procedures, and controls. You have to have an acceptable use policy. You have to have an information security policy. There's a set of minimums that you have to meet. And we're going to talk about some of this further on in the presentation. And the third bullet here is, you should try to be guided by the basic principles of information security. And those basic principles are defense in depth, least privilege, and default deny. Anytime you have to make a decision about security, go back to those, let them be your guide. You have to adapt to the needs of the business, but as you can, you want to try to stick with defense in depth, least privilege, and default deny.
Yeah, one of the things that policies, standards, and procedures help you do is to prevent knee-jerk reactions and keep you on track for what your goals are. Because I think the trend is to follow the news and look at the latest O-Day and the biggest hack and what happened, and people will drop what they're doing and go investigate that and try and put controls in place to mitigate that, when in reality, if they stuck to the course with their policies and procedures, they would end up with a better security program than jumping from what I call lily pad to lily pad, or whatever's the breach of the day.
Mm-hmm. Cool. With that, I'm going to jump into the next slide, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We wanted to give a quick overview. It's a framework. It can be found at nist.gov/cyber framework. And they have this graphic. It's a wheel. I'm not sure what the correct term for it is. But they divide the framework for building a security program into 5 categories. And those are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And the framework, it's pretty adaptable, it's risk-based, and they've done the legwork for you here with the cybersecurity framework. If you have to meet other compliance requirements, this isn't a compliance requirement, but they've done the legwork to help you meet compliance requirements like the CIS Top 20, COBIT, FISMA, some of the ISO standards. Jim, did you have anything to add there?
Nope, you covered it perfectly. Need to move on. Yep.
All right. So without any further ado, we're going to jump into the first category, identify. So we want to relate this all back to small and medium businesses, as we said. So we're not going to go through the specifics in the NIST CSF. You can download it for yourself, and it's broken out. So identify, they have a table with a lot of different things that you have to do, and again, mapping it to other security compliance requirements. But in general, at a high level, to have an effective security program, you have to know what your assets are. You have to know where your data is. You have to understand what the business does. What's your vertical. Like Jim said, you have to come up with a risk tolerance for the business, working with the leaders of the company. And then once you do that, go ahead, Jim.
One thing to keep in mind, that all of your assets don't necessarily have the same risk level, right? It depends on the kind of information and how you classify what data or what information is on those, right? Anything that might, for example, your credit card processing infrastructure might have a higher security requirement than maybe some public FTP site that you're sharing non-confidential, non-useful documents out to the public, right? Something like that. So you really got to know what your assets are and focus on the ones that are the most valuable to your organization. It's not a blanket one size fits all.
I agree, and I think it maps back to a risk assessment for the organization is key here as well, and it's a big component. Before, especially if you're you've been put in a role to build out a security program, one of the first things you have to do in that role is conduct a risk assessment for the organization, because your controls that you select are going to be determined by the results of the risk assessment, and some are going to be applied differently depending on the risk of the asset, the individual, the location. It all comes back to play. And we wanted to mention a few things on each of these categories where, more specific to small business, because there are lots of products out there that are expensive and do everything for you. But if you have minimal resources, if you have a small team, you can still run a lot of systems to track your assets, to build your policies. A few things we mentioned on the slide here, like Snipe IT, is a fairly inexpensive system for asset management. RT is the request tracker. It's an older ticketing system. It's actually written in Perl in the 90s, but it's still maintained and it's free. And RT has a way to track your assets, as well as it's a full ticketing system that you can use for change control and other things. With regards to policies, there are some places where you can get some free or inexpensive policy sets. There's a website called Security Made Easy that has a whole set of security policy templates that you can start with and then tailor to your organization. That's less than $1,000. And then the other day, Jim pointed out there's something called Comply, which it's a GitHub, right?
Yeah, GitHub. You can download it from GitHub, install it on a VM, and it manages all of your security policies in one place through a web interface. It's a pretty slick service. It's all open source, all free.
And you answer questions about your organization, and it basically generates policies for you, right?
Yep. And then you can go in and customize those going forward. If you need to do more customization, they're editable. So
yep.
It gets you a good framework in place, so you can kind of get a feel for how you should be organizing your information and your policy, so you don't spend too much time on things that aren't relevant.
Mm-hmm. And of course, another item that is part of Identify is having documentation of your configurations of your network, of your data flows. So that's also very important. We're going to jump ahead to Protect, because we actually have 2 slides on Protect, and there's a ton of information on here, but we want to kind of hit some of the highlights and things that you definitely can do at a small to medium-sized business without a ton of resources. And some of the tools that I'm most impressed with today, I really don't have a Microsoft tattoo, but I'm really impressed with the capabilities today in Intune for managing mobile devices, especially if you have an organization where you have a lot of remote workers. With Intune now, you can set it up like you used to be able to do with Active Directory on-prem, where you can configure policies, you can lock down PCs, you can push patches, you can run antivirus, you can configure, your VPN clients, and it's just there's a whole lot you can do there. And you might not realize you're already paying for it if you use Office 365 for your email. So that's a way that you can hit it.
Yeah, if you are using Office 365, definitely enable 2FA. That's not even an option. That should be the first thing that you do. It's pretty straightforward. The Microsoft Authenticator is a free application. You can just turn it on for your users within Office 365, and they'll get used to it very quickly.
So yep, 2FA, also very important. There are some tools out there that aren't really expensive. Google Authenticator is free, and it plugs into a lot of applications. If you're using a web-based system for tracking IT assets, you're running WordPress for your company's website, it's free to you to go out and integrate Google Authenticator in for your logins there. Password management is something that is very important as well. You have a lot of different vendors, you have a lot of different systems that you log into. And today there are a lot of different tools that you can use. We mentioned LastPass on our slide here. There's also a tool called Password Safe that I think Bruce Schneier was the original author of the application, and it's open source. It's out there. It's been evaluated, and it's totally free. It also has a mobile component that you can use.
And one of the things that we talked about, Russell, in our preparation for this was network segmentation, including your Wi-Fi networks. Most companies don't consider that until it's too late, right? They let people bring in their own devices, connect to their production internal networks, and that can lead to some serious problems. We've talked about also others not having wired connectivity to production networks. That adds definitely some other security concerns that you need to be aware of if you choose not to have wired connections on your network. So these are all things that you have to think through when you're deciding what I'm going to make as my standard within my business.
Yep, if you can do it, absolutely. I agree 100%. We did that at one of the companies that I've worked for that still had PCs on everyone's desk. So it wasn't as mobile of a company that you might expect to walk into today. But because we had desktops and we were hardwired, we set up a completely segmented guest Wi-Fi that employees also used for their phones and iPads and whatever else. And when I say completely segmented, it was on a dedicated cable modem, dedicated wiring throughout the building, and APs. There was no way to cross over. It was like you're up the street of Panera. So if you can do that, then it also removes any of the Wi-Fi components of any compliance that you have to meet. If you can say, well, we don't use Wi-Fi, there's no Wi-Fi in our LAN, then it's completely out of scope. You don't even have to worry about it. A couple other things here before we move forward to the next slide. Security awareness training. It doesn't take a lot of resources to put together a security awareness training program, and it's really critical. I think you would probably, all the hosts would probably agree that people generally are one of the greatest vulnerabilities in an organization, and security awareness training, for onboarding and at least annually, I think is the minimum that you need to put in place. And there are lots of free resources out there that you can use. There are some inexpensive ones like KnowBe4, where you can set up an awareness training program that's fairly self-service and automated, and you can put things in order. So you can have a requirement that new hires have to go through and read your confidentiality agreement before they can see any of your policies and go through and see things that are company proprietary. And then you can also set up periods of time, like their first 3 weeks or 6 weeks, that they have to complete training. And then another thing that you want to do, if you can, is phishing simulations. And there are some inexpensive tools, and I think some free tools even, to do this today. Let's see, Lucy Security is a fairly inexpensive one that I've used before. That's pretty new, and it's pretty effective. I mean, these are all things that I put in place with really one dedicated resource at a company and a fairly small team. A couple other quick things here. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things we've run into with compliance is most of the auditors are very keen on you having pretty strict identity management. In other words, what users are granted what access to what resources, when were they granted, how often are they checked, and what happens in the process when those users either leave the company or move to a different department. And if you don't have a way to track that, that's going to be a major problem for you.
Certainly, those are requirements for 853 for FISMA. I think that they're also mapped down to NIST 800-171, which really applies today to all defense contractors. The government, it used to only require apply to defense contractors under certain portions of the FAR, but they recently changed it where basically any defense contractor who has any CUI, which is controlled unclassified information, which really, if you have contract information and documentation on what you're doing for the DoD, that's CUI. So almost any contract, any defense contractor has to meet all of NIST 800-171, which is a subset of 853. So let's see, what did we not mention here? Last but not least, ransomware. What's the best way to handle ransomware? I mean, obviously you want to have defense in depth, right? Least privilege. You want to control access to places, use a web proxy, have plenty of email filtering and other things. But if you do get hit with ransomware, you want to know not only that you have backups, but that you have restores. Mm-hmm. If you need to conduct regular retests of your backups for storing data to ensure that you can do that if the time comes and you need to. So backups, they really are key to surviving ransomware. And you don't have to be a huge organization to have backups. If nothing else, once a week, plug in an external drive and back up all your important data. And that's for even a mom and pop shop. I mean, this isn't complicated. Yeah. There are plenty of consumer grade cloud backup tools that work really well nowadays. A larger organization should have more of a managed backup, should be, in my opinion, should be writing to something that goes offline so that if you do have an advanced ransomware or crypto locker type of attack, it can't also encrypt your backups. So, if you can get your backups to another location or even onto tape, then it gives you another level of capability if you have an incident like that. Okay. Our second slide on protect, a few more things. We mentioned email, spam filtering. SPF and DMARC are pretty important for protecting your email, trying to protect against phishing attacks. Again, mobile device management, software applications are Intune on everything.
One of the simple things you can do with email is mark the emails, whether they're coming from an internal or external source. So that will limit, phishing emails from internal people. If it's marked as external, it's obviously not coming from the person that says it's coming from. Another thing that you can do is institute certificates where you have users validated 2 certificates when they send through Microsoft Exchange or through Outlook or something like that, so that you can guarantee that the email came from the person that it claims to have come from. And these are all simple things to implement. Most people just don't bother to ask about them.
We mentioned a few things here that are maybe a little more advanced, but if you do have a security engineer or two and some resources, you can put together email encryption, DLP, which is getting easier with Office 365, and something that's unique that actually is easier to do if you're a small to medium-sized business, especially if you're, say, US only. If you don't do any international business, is you can implement geoprotection and even TLD filtering, where you block domains other than .com, .net, .org, or regular domains that you need to do your business. If you exclude everything else, it really prevents your endpoints from accessing where most of phishing, ransomware, and things are set up, because they're usually on those unusual TLDs.
Yep. One of the things that's kind of near and dear to my heart, if you look up some of the talks I've given in the past, my area of expertise is DNS, and DNS filtering is probably one of the easiest ways that you can block a lot of malicious traffic. So by logging what's happening on your network from DNS and what's happening and limiting where your DNS servers go, you can definitely implement a high level of protection that you wouldn't have if you didn't bother to look at your DNS. But everybody says it's DNS, and it's always DNS.
It's always DNS. But if you don't have resources to spend on that level of DNS filtering and monitoring, set up your resolvers to use OpenDNS or Google DNS. The free tiers, they do basic blocking of known malicious sites, things like that. So into detect, we're talking about having endpoint detection, which pretty much everyone does today. You've got some type of antivirus. There's pretty advanced tools, CrowdStrike, that can do a lot more. But everyone, you have to have that minimum. You need to have some type of endpoint detection. And if you have a resource, we highly recommend that you have some network detection capability, some network monitoring, intrusion detection, IPS. You can use Zeek, which used to be called Bro, to get a lot better insight into your network. And then I've done several presentations. I would say this is one of my areas of expertise is logging and SIM. And it's critical, and we could talk about it for the duration of the time here. But, you need to have visibility into what's happening on your network. And the way to do that is with logging, with correlation and SIM.
Yep. Definitely. One of the things that people try to do is HTTPS inspection. That's becoming harder and harder to accomplish. And if you follow the trends in TLS, TLS 1.3 will no longer support unencrypted SNI, server name indicators, so you won't really be able to man-in-the-middle HTTPS connections that are TLS 1.3. So if you're relying on that or want to implement some sort of HTTPS inspection, you're better off spending your time on something else at this point.
We also have a note about availability and performance monitoring. And so I've used it before to, detect when there are unusual events on the network. If you know what your baseline is, you know what your normal bandwidth looks like with a simple monitoring tool like PRTG, Site 24/7. I mean, there are tons of them. If you just pay attention to your bandwidth, it can be an indicator that you have a data exfil or any of a number of things going on. It doesn't take that much time to have a graph running that you can, peek at a few times a day. You could also set up, alerts based on thresholds. You can get a lot further into this, but as a baseline, you should be doing some monitoring of your bandwidth and of the performance of your servers and systems. So jumping into respond. So we're talking here about how do you respond when there is an incident. So incident response planning, having an incident response policy and procedures. And this can be as simple as, we have a retainer with a company that knows how to do incident response, and if something happens, we call them. It can also be as simple as, if a device appears to have malware on it, we nowadays using cloud storage, SharePoint Online, things like that, it's getting even easier, especially if you're implementing a zero trust model where the data doesn't really live on your endpoints. If there's any indication that there's something going on, wipe the device, reload it, and move on. Another big component to response is having some business continuity planning. You want to sit down and talk with stakeholders at your organization about what do we do if we get hit with ransomware, right? Beyond, continuity planning for a power outage or, loss of a major contract or loss of staff, but you want to sit down and talk about what do we do if we get hit with a major incident.
Yeah, a couple of things that you need to keep in mind here too, from a compliance point of view, is if an incident does happen, certain kinds of incidents need to be reported to differing authorities depending on what kind of compliance you're looking at. For example, if you do business in the EU, you have a certain period of time to report a specific kind of data breach to the authority in that EU country where those customers live. So you need to make sure that you understand what those requirements are from a reporting capability, and then the best way to handle that is to have some legal counsel, but also to have some pre-made playbooks, so you can have your responses prepared ahead of time and rehearsed, not written on the fly, because when you're under panic and you have an issue that you have to deal with, that's not the best time to be writing copy that you put out in front of your customers. Yep.
All right. Absolutely. And if you have some resources, you can build some of your own IR capabilities with traffic analysis and file integrity monitoring, SIM. And I've got the images there from Cuckoo Sandbox where you can test files that you think might be malicious and see what they do on a system, on a clean system. Yep. And Autopsy for forensic analysis. And there are other tools as well. So the last part of the CSF is recover. And again, so this is disaster recovery planning, being able to conduct some incident analysis and some post-mortem to continuously improve your capabilities.
Yeah, the one thing you want to do is you want to look at your processes and always have feedback from other people on the outside, if they're friends from conferences that you visit. In discussions, I've learned so much from talking to people like Russ and Jeff and others about what goes on in their business, our business, their experiences, and you can take that information back and make what you do in your organization that much better. So make sure you take that opportunity when you have it.
And the last, I guess, probably less than a minute here we have left. Another thing that we don't have a slide on is if you have to meet compliance, you have to be able to generate artifacts for your auditors. And one of the easy ways to do that, with limited resources, is to use a ticketing system. You probably have a help desk ticketing system to track requests from, your internal users and your customers. You can use that ticketing system to create the documentation that you need to provide to your auditors. For onboarding, for terminations, for granting someone access. Jim mentioned earlier, someone moves to a different role in the company, you need an authorization that they get access to what they need in that new role, and you can put all of that into a ticketing system to make it easier to generate artifacts for your auditors.
It looks like we made it through in a lot of time.
Yeah, congratulations, guys. I know that was hard to do, and I'm sure there was a lot more war stories and experiences you could share for each of the elements, or the 5 components, at least based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I know I have questions and comments. I'm sure the other co-hosts do, but first let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll pick your talk apart.